Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. I'm speaking with my favorite Congressman, Thomas Massie, about a bunch of stuff. The prospects of DOGE in Congress, not looking good so far. Tariffs and the success of MAHA with the appointment of guys like RFK Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya. And finally, this ridiculous bill that is attempting to legislate whether or not you can refuse to buy products from another country. Check it out. Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Congressman, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Matt.
I felt like we needed to get back together. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on Capitol Hill. Not so much good stuff, but I'm hoping we can at least end this conversation optimistically. Let's see if we can get there. But
okay, let's try.
I thought that this proposed legislation, it's Tuesday, and the vote was supposed to happen yesterday. It's been postponed. This proposed legislation that would fine and even jail American citizens for boycotting products and companies in Israel. I thought that was the most insane thing I've ever heard. Is that possibly constitutional?
It's not constitutional. I mean, I think it's a violation, at least of the First Amendment. What was it? Citizens United decided that spending money was free speech. That was speech. But it's deeper than that. It's not about political advertising. It's about, can you be compelled to use your money to support or not support other countries? It seems pretty ridiculous. Now, the bill that we would have voted on this week actually just expands a law that already exists, and it's existed since 2018. It was snuck into the National Defense Authorization Act. And you have to be really careful about the NDAA because they put lots of stuff in there that's not germane, because that's one of those bills like the omnibus or whatever that they know is going to pass every year. So they put stuff in that bill. So
can't vote against it. You're un-American if you do.
Oh, well, if you vote against it, then you didn't want the soldiers to get a pay raise.
Right.
What kind of commie are you? So, and that's the ad that they'll run. You voted against a pay raise for the soldiers. But inside of that bill, they made 20 years in prison up to, or $1 million fine if you participated in a boycott that some other foreign country initiated against one of our friendly countries. Well, this bill we were going to vote on this week would have expanded that to say if an IGO like the United Nations has a boycott and that an American citizen participates in that boycott, that they could be fined or imprisoned. But how do you know you're participating in that boycott? Maybe you're just exercising your own discretion and saying, I don't like products from this country, or I'm not going to buy a product from this country because they're bombing another country. That's your freedom. How you spend your money is you're free to do. Now, I got to give a lot of credit to Marjorie Taylor Greene. She came out before I did, saw this coming on the radar and just railed on it on social media.
It was an epic tweet.
It was epic. It had a graphic to go with the epicness. And, because everything's a graphic.
Yeah.
And I retweeted it. And there was another congresswoman that joined in. And to my knowledge, there were only 3 of us that were against this vocally. But the leadership saw the writing on the wall, and they pulled the bill this week. So fortunately, we did not expand the unconstitutional law that already exists in a way that would have been really bad.
So I just assumed, based on the many conversations I've had with you and his behavior over the years, that Mike Johnson was just going to use Democrats to pass the bill.
Well, if they're not particularly principled, but if they saw an opportunity to make him look bad,
yeah,
they could have found their principles overnight and then voted against this, and then there could have been enough Republicans to vote against it that it could have gone down, and which would have been a wonderful thing, because I think it was also Marjorie who made this accusation, or somebody, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it's legitimate. So I guess I'm making
regardless of the source.
Yeah. There's a governor's race in New York coming up, and the sponsor of this bill, I'd rather not say his name, probably wanted to score some points in New York. Although it's ostensibly about Israel, it would score points with the Republican Jewish base or maybe independent Jewish people in New York. And so I think he was rushing to virtue signal. The problem is you could put Americans in jail for 20 years with your virtue signal, because his intention was to make it a law. And the real question is, why would Mike Johnson put this on the floor? I blame the leadership. There's 435 people in Congress. Anybody's capable of having a bad idea, but your leadership should be the one that says, okay, this is a really bad idea. It's bad from a policy standpoint. It's also bad politics. Why were we going to put this on the floor? At least, thanks to Marjorie and myself and an army of people on social media who started blowing this thing up before it got to the floor, at least the leadership had the wisdom to get off the train tracks. Yeah.
Well, my initial reaction, just reading the name of the bill before I knew just how truly awful it was.
Did it have the word fair? Or
I don't remember what it's called anymore, but I just my initial reaction is, why is Mike Johnson wasting floor time on this garbage when there's actually supposedly a budget process happening? And it turns out that it was far worse than that. But before we get off this topic, wait,
hold on.
Okay.
The goal last week and this week is to waste floor time.
Okay.
You don't understand, Matt. Like, the big, beautiful bill is being, the lobbyists are working on this thing behind the scenes, and it's not ready for prime time yet. But we got to act like we're doing something in Congress. So last week, we became the nanny state. We passed 5 new regulations. I can't even remember exactly what they were, all 5 of them. And 2 of them were Democrat-sponsored bills. They all came out of the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm pretty sure all 5 of them were unconstitutional. I voted against all 5 of them. But I thought in November people voted for less government. And here last week, I called it Nanny State Week in Congress. They thought these weren't that controversial, and then we just march time and get these done while we're waiting for the lobbyists to get done with the big, beautiful bill or whoever's writing it. And then this week is mostly just a waste of time, and they thought, imprisoning Americans for 20 years and $1 million fines would not be controversial. So that was just sort of a time-wasting bill, honestly, so that one member of Congress could get a leg up on a governor's race.
20 years or $1 million.
Or both.
Or both for choosing to not engage in commerce.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
I'm struggling with this. And this was my last question on the subject, because I would assume that the definitions of what is an enemy country endorsing a boycott and what is non-commerce that's illegal, is this all subject to interpretation by the Department of Justice? Like, who gets to decide?
It gives broad discretion to the executive, the president, and it might not always be this president. It's not always going to be this president. He's got, 3 years and 8 months in office, and then he's term limited. And at which point this bill still is active. So it's at the discretion of the executive branch, and then also at the discretion of the judicial branch, because these aren't tightly defined terms.
I have this wild idea. I haven't yet gotten anyone to take the bet, but I have this idea that someday a Democrat will sit in the White House. Someday. I don't know when. Maybe.
Whoa, I don't know if that will ever happen, Matt. Is there any precedent for that?
I don't know. And we're creating all these extraordinary executive powers. It's great. What could go wrong?
Nothing.
The one thing we're not doing is seeming to move forward on actual budgets and legislation that would implement the DOGE proposals. One of the things that I've been really excited about, I know you've been excited about it, and I'm wondering where we are on that, because we were, you guys against your vote passed a budget resolution, and then you passed another CR, and I didn't see any of the DOGE and that stuff. But I assume the appropriations bills are slaving away to get these done. Pardon my sarcasm.
No, yeah, it's warranted. There was a moment at the State of the Union address where Trump was rattling off a list of things that DOGE had found that were really embarrassing wastes of money. And he in Trump's style, he was talking it up, and it was great. It really was great. He was just, his intonation made fun of this stuff. And my colleagues got up on the Republican side of the aisle and were just clapping every time, like, yeah, that's ridiculous. I can't believe we're spending money on this. And to me, it was almost like a dystopian future. It was like, wait, you guys are standing up and clapping because he's making fun of what you spent money on.
Yes.
Like, you are the ones, you wrote these bills, you voted for these bills, and now you're clapping that he's making fun of the money that you spent. It was pretty wild.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're making the connection, or at least people aren't holding them to account, because Congress has the power of the purse. Now, DOGE has found a lot of things, a lot of wasteful things that need to be cut. It adds up to billions of dollars. The problem is we have trillion-dollar problems, and DOGE has billion-dollar solutions. Now, I hope that we do cut that ridiculous money, but last week and this week, particularly this week, I got excited. We were supposed to come to Congress and vote on rescissions. I was like, whew, finally. Rescissions, by the way, are a way to cut money, and you don't need 60 votes in the Senate. You can do it with 51 votes. So because we have a majority in the Senate and the House, we could actually consummate the things that DOGE has done. Unfortunately, we passed a continuing resolution that funds all the things that DOGE, this was like a week after everybody clapped for the DOGE cuts they found. They funded all of it in Congress, and a lot of Republicans voted for that CR. So I was excited. I'm like, okay, well, you voted for it in the CR. We're going to come back and rescind that money. And the money was going to be rescinded for like PBS, NPR, and USAID, which, are things that Republicans shouldn't be for. Well, guess what? It got pulled from the docket, these rescission votes. Why is that? It's because when you dig down into it, Republicans, there are too many Republicans who support that nonsense, like socialized broadcasting and money to NGOs that are funneling money to organizations that they might be on the boards of.
Yeah.
They're not going to cut that stuff.
I grokked the Republican legislators on sitting on the boards of NGOs that are funded by USAID, and it gave me guys like Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham. Yeah, I know you'd be shocked to know that, but it said mostly I don't know, which is maybe it's a grok thing, but I bet you there's layers of mystery between where the money goes in and where it comes out.
Well, and don't forget, Trump has endorsed Lindsey Graham's reelection now, which is interesting to say the least.
Has he endorsed your reelection? I can't remember that.
Well,
part.
Actually, he's endorsed my primary opponent, whoever that might be. He said he
there
would
isn't
recruit
one yet, right?
somebody against me. Yeah, there's nobody serious that's up for the task yet. But I want to cut government. Lindsey Graham wants to fund bigger government, and Trump has endorsed Lindsey Graham, who's for the next war already. I'm against the next war already, regardless of where it is, in both instances. And anyways, that's where we are.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with BlazeTV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. I always try to find the optimistic part of that story. Lindsey's Republican primary doesn't happen until June of next year. So theoretically, if we do all of these rescissions and all of these entitlement changes through reconciliation that reflect the things that we were promised, Lindsey might actually have to do it.
Maybe so.
Maybe
see.
so.
But the House, just to tidy this up or wrap it up, the House was scheduled to vote on rescissions and we didn't. And there should be a big news story there, and there's not. Yeah.
Well, that's the dirty secret on stuff like USAID, probably everything in the budget. Like Republicans are complicit in passing all of this stuff and perhaps creating these programs in the first place. So it's not like they're going to do it on their own. It's going to have to be the kind of grassroots pressure we saw primarily coming through MAHA when RFK Jr. My best guesstimate is that a majority of Republicans did not want to vote for RFK to be the head of HHS, but they did it anyway.
Right, and Trump has a mandate to do things like that, but it's going to wear off.
Right.
And when I spoke to him personally after the election, I told him he had about 3 months, maybe 6, and then the senators are going to ignore you at that point, and you're going to get to a midterm election fairly soon where people are way more interested in their reelection than they are the last election mandate. And anyways, we're past the 100-day mark. We're past the 3-month mark. A lot of the senators aren't feeling as much pressure now to do those things. Although I would say that of all the, if you look across the board, the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Defense, the bright spot where the sort of revolutionary aspect of voting for Trump was consummated with an appointment that was true to those principles is RFK Jr. becoming head of HHS. And then the people under him, like Jay Bhattacharya and Makari, if that is where, if I were in Vegas and putting all my chips on one thing, I'd put it right there, because those are real revolutionaries in the sense that they represent America first and freedom, health freedom, and in the sense that they are appealing not just to Republicans but independents and Democrats, because they're just for American principles. I think that's where he's done the best job, and I'm hopeful that will produce some results.
Yeah, I think that's the place where we can be most optimistic. And you probably saw Tulsi Gabbard was talking to Megyn Kelly a couple days ago, and she said that she's working directly with Jay Bhattacharya to, I don't think she said get to the bottom of who exactly funded gain-of-function research.
Well, we did.
Right. Well, we know the answers to these questions. We know who created the virus and we know who funded it. But to actually have the government officially say, we did this and we'll never do it again, that's a big deal.
Well, when the COVID thing broke out, let's say February, March of 2020, the Trump administration, I'm not going to say which person in particular, went to the president and said, hey, we're actually funding this right now, this gain of function research. We need to kind of stop it. And I know this person personally, and they went to the president and they did quit funding it, but it was funded by the United States.
Yeah.
And there was information sharing as well.
This and you forgot to mention, completely relevant to this, Senator Rand Paul is now the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and he has new subpoena power. And it does look like this administration is ready to cooperate with the good guys all the way up the line.
So we had, even before the Senate was in the majority, we were in the majority, and I was chair of a subcommittee of Judiciary Committee on the administrative, state, and regulatory reform. So I convinced Jim Jordan to let me bring in the two vaccine experts that mysteriously left the FDA under a cloud under Biden when the vaccines went from EUA to the full BLA, which is go from emergency use to an actual approval. And when the boosters got their EUA, and when the mandates happened, this all happened like in the fall, that first fall of Biden's administration. Two people who were the top vaccine experts at FDA left. I was able to bring them in and depose them. Now they were actually friendly witnesses, and Marion Gruber and Philip Krause were their names. They worked for a gentleman named Peter Marks, and after they were run off, they were basically run off because they refused to twist the science so that the Biden administration could do mandates, and then they also didn't necessarily believe that everybody needed a booster because they understood immunology. They'd done this for 30 years each. The good news is Peter Marks, who was their boss, who took over their jobs after he ran them off and then just approved everything himself, even though he's not an immunologist. He's gone. Like, he has left. They always call it a resignation. I don't know if he was fired or pushed out or just resigned because he couldn't do his dirty tricks anymore. And I had a hearing on this, so I'm actually very happy about that. If we're talking about accountability, yeah, nothing has happened to him for violating what I would say are laws or at least norms at the FDA, but at least he's gone. There are some things that are happening and have happened.
Yeah, it does look like they are cleaning house, mostly.
Now we need to get mRNA shots off of the childhood vaccine schedule, but I can appreciate how hard that is to do when you're at the top of this organism that lives on its own. But its bloodstream is funded by Congress.
Yeah. So we've never talked about this, and I don't know fully what I think about it yet, but one of the many red pills I took during lockdowns, I was eating them by the shovelful.
Yeah.
Is the insanely dangerous entanglement between pharmaceutical companies and the regulatory agencies, to the point where the regulatory agencies and the actual regulators own intellectual property in the products that they're approving and then mandating. That's not a market. That's in no way representative of a free market. There's a different word for it that starts with F, but it's not the market.
It should be completely banned. And if nothing else, there should be absolute disclosure at the top of the web of every government web page that, hey, this person, this person, this person, and this person receives some kind of royalties or funding. Just like on a research paper, you're supposed to, any of the people who are authors of the paper are supposed to disclose any of the money that they got from those pharmaceutical companies. We should do the same thing with anybody in the government that's receiving funding, but the government itself receives money from pharma. A few years ago, the pharmaceutical companies convinced Congress and the government that it's taking too long to approve these drugs because you don't have enough resources. So we would be willing to actually pay for the approvals. The pharmaceutical company said there aren't enough appropriations from Congress, so we'll give the FDA money, and then that will increase the bandwidth. The number of approvers will expand, and this will help the general public. And so through our altruistic instincts, we want to give the FDA money so that they can approve our products more efficiently. What could possibly go wrong? And that happened. And so now the private companies pay the FDA to approve their drugs.
Yeah.
I mean, not in that direct route. They pay for the reviewers. But once that connection is established, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah. So you see that institutional corruption, and then you see the growth, as RFK Jr. likes to talk about, the vaccine schedule for infants has grown just astronomically, probably coinciding precisely with this corruption in his institutions. And as a pro-market guy, I'm like, that's not a market. That's something else.
One thing that fixes all this is to restore liability. There's the 1986, I think it is, liability immunity that was granted to the pharmaceutical companies that have vaccines. But worse than that is the PrEP Act, pandemic preparedness or something other. I call it medical malpractice martial law, which says that regardless of what the state laws say and any federal law says, once we declare this as an emergency, all the products, not just vaccines, but the masks, which, by the way, if you've ever cleaned out the lint filter on your dryer, that's probably what your lungs look like if you've been wearing a mask for several years.
People are still doing it.
The fibers come off of that,
yeah.
Right? Like, just wash your clothes, dry them in your dryer, and scrape it off. Those are the same kinds of fibers that are going into your lungs if you keep wearing those masks, particularly if you reuse that mask, which people are. And particularly if you're using like some kind of bandana/cloth mask instead of like an N95 mask. Well, you could never in your life sue those people, ever, because it's an indemnity that's larger than the vaccine protection. It's called the PrEP Act, and it doesn't matter what any state law says, and everybody's covered, you know. If you slip and fall in a puddle on the way to get your vaccine, you literally can't sue somebody because they're covered under the PrEP Act.
Or you can't see the puddle because you're wearing a mask and it destroys your peripheral vision.
I have constituents in my district who the mom went in to give them a flu shot and they got like a COVID vaccine shot by accident. And it's like they argued it was covered under the PrEP Act. Or in a nursing home, let's say somebody falls in the hallway because there's water and they're trying to sue the nursing home for, you're on your way to get the vaccine. So you're covered under the PrEP Act. I mean, this thing is so broad. I call it medical malpractice martial law because it supersedes every other law and the Constitution, in my opinion. Because the 7th Amendment, you remember what that one says?
No.
Okay, because nobody does. But I think it's $50. You're entitled to a jury trial in any issue that's $50 or more, but which may be a couple $1,000s these days, maybe $5,000. But you know, the PrEP Act overrides that too.
That was a final thought on this, because I think one of the many buckets of red pills that I swallowed during the pandemic was realizing that an emergency is the Achilles heel of the entire constitutional project.
Let's talk about emergencies. So the president can declare emergencies. And he can use the declaration of emergency to underwrite a tariff, which is what President Trump is doing right now. Anybody who says that what Trump is doing right now is illegal actually hasn't studied the law. It is legal. Congress has granted authority to the president to impose tariffs under certain emergency situations. And most recently, he said there's some kind of emergency for Hollywood. And so now he's going to tariff foreign films.
Well, if you've watched anything coming out of Hollywood, it is kind of it's a crisis. It's maybe not an emergency, but it's garbage.
There's some kind of crisis there.
Yeah. If you made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we create at Free the People. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show.
It's these emergencies, these presidential emergencies that we complained about when Biden was president, to do all of the heinous things he did under COVID. But the president right now is using the emergencies to underpin the tariffs. Now, there's a law that says that if a president declares an emergency, that within 15 days, the House and the Senate can vote on it, any member of the Senate and any member of the House, on whether there's actually a real emergency. I mean, wouldn't you want your legislative body to decide instead of one person on the planet to decide if there's an emergency? So when they decided that the president has this kind of emergency powers, they wisely said, well, Congress should be the check on that. So in the Senate, there have been votes on whether there's actually an emergency or not. And these are basically proxy votes on the tariffs. So you've seen Senator Rand Paul has famously or infamously come out against the tariffs, and some other Republicans.
You know he's a rhino now.
Yeah, that's what I hear. And, when people say that about me or Senator Rand Paul, I'm like, well, if your typical Republican is a true Republican in Washington, D.C., I might not be what that is. But if you look at the Republican platform, the one that is ratified at the Republican convention, I think Senator Paul is the epitome of that, and I am as well. Or when you think about the things that Reagan said, when he said, libertarianism is at the heart of the Republican platform. We are the most true Republicans that exist, I believe. But in any case, you had a vote in the Senate on whether there was actually an emergency and whether these tariffs should be allowed to stand. Is that because John Thune decided there should be a vote? No, he doesn't want to vote on that. It's because there's a federal law that says you have within 15 days, if a president declares an emergency, you have to allow any member of both legislative bodies to bring it to the floor and have a vote. So they've had a couple of those votes in the Senate. You know what? We've had none of those votes in the House. And what I'm about to tell you, most members of Congress don't even understand. Because I served on the Rules Committee, I know how this works. What they have done in the House of Representatives is, I believe, illegal. They have skirted the law, the emergencies law, the presidential emergencies law, which says that within 15 days you can bring a bill to the floor to countermand that emergency. Maybe it's not really an emergency, but we haven't done that in the House. Is that because none of the 435 of us want to vote on whether it's an emergency or not to have tariffs? No. It's because the Rules Committee, of which I used to serve on, I served on it for 2 years, and we never did any of this funky crap in the Rules Committee when I was on it, because I said, if you put me on this committee, we're not doing any of this crap, because I've seen it before and we'll never do it while I'm on the Rules Committee, and they didn't. But now that I'm not on the Rules Committee, they're back to their old ways. And so in the Rules Committee, they passed a rule out of the Rules Committee in the House that says, for the purposes of the Emergencies Act, a day is not a day. In other words, to get around the 15-day requirement to vote on a presidential emergency, the Rules Committee says a day is not a day. And then they slip that sentence into a resolution that has to do with the big, beautiful bill that's coming up. And nobody's going to vote against bringing the big, beautiful bill to the floor. So that's what they slipped it into. A day is not a day. And so anybody in the House, unlike the Senate, where they don't have a Rules Committee that does this monkey business, anybody in the House, Democrat or Republican, who says, I don't think that's really an emergency, we need to have a vote on this, they're shut down automatically. They can't use the law, not the House rule, the law that says it has to come to the floor. And that's why we've never had a vote on this in the House. Now, the Rules Committee is only 13 people. It's 9 in the majority and 4 in the minority. 13 people of 435 cannot dictate what the 435 do for rules. So they pass a resolution out of that committee, and then they bring it to the floor of the House. At least 218 Republicans voted for that rule to say that a day is not a day. It was slipped in there. Most of my colleagues didn't see it. And so we've never had a vote on tariffs in the House. And the first time they did that, I was the only Republican to vote no. The second time they did it, I told my colleague, Victoria Spartz from Indiana, I'm like, do you realize what they're doing? They're like skirting the law here. And she was like, oh my gosh. And so she also voted with me the second time they did that. But that is why, if you're watching this podcast, or what do you call your show?
I call it whatever you want it to be.
Right.
I call it a show because it's on BlazeTV.
Okay.
But the kids, including the young people that I work for at Free the People, tell me it's a podcast.
All right. If you're watching this show or listening to this podcast, know that the reason we haven't voted on tariffs in the House is that Mike Johnson's committee, the Rules Committee, which is also known as the Speaker's Committee, which I used to serve on for 2 years when it was Kevin McCarthy's committee, has put forth on the floor a resolution that says a day is not a day. And why will the Supreme Court not intervene in this violation of the law that the House has undertaken? Because the Constitution says that each house shall make its own rules. And so when the House makes a rule that overrides a law, the Supreme Court is reluctant to go in and referee that fight. And I'm not too upset about that. Like, I wouldn't want the Supreme Court to be able to intervene in too many of our arguments inside the House. So at the end of the day, it really is up to the people. You have to look at, what did your congressman do, and are you going to send him back? And I kind of like that separation of powers.
So if a day is not a day, do the people listening to this have to actually get up and go to work tomorrow?
Well, they're not in the House of Representatives, so unfortunately they do.
Actually do have to show up to work.
The rule only applies to 435 people on the planet.
Will you introduce legislation to define how long a day is?
I would like to, but it gets complicated. Sometimes the next day doesn't start until 10 a.m. so that they can do some funky business between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. Yeah. I'm telling you, I was on the Rules Committee. I've been in the deepest part of the sausage grinder that makes the sausage that becomes your laws. And I know this for a fact. So
let's try to be more optimistic than we are right now, which is not hard since we've set a nice low floor for pessimism. Let's imagine a scenario, because you mentioned like the clock is ticking, and members of Congress are very soon going to start thinking about reelection. They probably already are. They
never stop.
They never stop, and they probably know that the party in power usually loses seats in the midterm, particularly if the economy's weak, and we don't know where that's going to be. But it would not be unusual for Republicans to lose seats and maybe lose the House. They could lose a lot of things depending on the standing of the party.
Which, if we were Democrats, knowing that, We would be swinging for the fences right now.
Yes, that's where Obamacare came from.
That's right. Instead, we're pretending we're going to keep these marginal seats. I'm not saying marginal members, but marginal, seats to win. We're pretending we're going to protect them. They call them the majority makers. When we meet behind closed doors, they give deferential treatment to the people in the marginal seats. Oh, you're a majority maker. Here, go to the microphone. Take an extra minute. We'll put your bill on the floor.
Well, you might have a tough primary coming up.
If the worst thing that happens to me is I lose my primary and I go back to my farm, I'll be okay.
Yeah, it might be a blessing, right?
Could be.
But so, as you were saying, the president's political capital is going to wane over time. His ability and the ability of the people that support an America First agenda to pressure members of Congress, Republicans at the margin in both the House and the Senate. I think more about the Senate because I just feel like there's a lot more squishy neocons in the Senate, but I might be wrong. The window is closing, and the best window would have been the first 100 days to do all of these rescissions and DOGE reforms and new authorizations to get rid of these programs. Is it possible legally, forget politically, but legally, can the administration airdrop in through reconciliation a rescission package, which is mostly discretionary spend? It is discretionary, but also not only the taxes, but entitlement changes, which DOGE is also proposed to get rid of the dead people. Can you bundle that all up and pass it through the Senate with 50 plus 1?
51 votes. When would this happen?
I mean, presumably this is going to happen in the fall, right?
So
I haven't seen a schedule, but typically, like the end of the fiscal year
in the
is
omnibus type stuff. Yeah. They could. No, I think the OMB director. I think what he's hoping is that Trump just won't spend this money, and that when we get to September 30th, this would be for fiscal year 2025, that when we get to September 30th, if they have successfully not spent this money, that it will go back to the Treasury. I mean, it's a decent strategy. They've tried to give people early retirement or early leave, although that's not working out real well. I know some people who work for the federal government who tried to take that early leave and they were told they weren't eligible. They've tried a lot of things, with executive action that may or may not work. But again, those are billion-dollar solutions to trillion-dollar problems. This reconciliation bill we have is the ultimate opportunity to touch the 2/3 of the government that's on autopilot, Medicaid, Medicare. You can't deal with Social Security in that, but you can deal with the stuff that's on autopilot, and my colleagues just do not want to do it. And Victoria Spartz, good friend of mine from Indiana, who's U.S. representative, she grew up in Soviet Ukraine. She knows what oligarchy looks like. She has pointed out that, the things that Republicans are touting, like work requirements for Medicaid, are not going to work. It's not going to kick people off of Medicaid, able-bodied single individuals with no dependents. It's not going to push them off Medicaid because it says that as long as you're taking a training program, you also qualify. You don't technically have to work. You just have to be trying to get educated. She has pointed out that the real waste, fraud, and abuse is the money that's going to the healthcare systems, like the oligarchs, the hospital systems, the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies. And she said that you really don't have to kick anybody off of Medicaid. All you got to do is deal with the waste, fraud, and abuse that goes to corporations. And I think she's right. But my colleagues are not ready to do that. because part of it is because they don't understand. Another part of it is they don't want to understand because they're getting money from the oligarchs to keep funding the waste, fraud, and abuse. But that's what's going to, really take this country down. By the way, this big, beautiful bill that's coming up, the reconciliation bill, it's not supposed to adjust policy. It's only supposed to adjust mandatory spending. It's not supposed to adjust the thing that you talked about, which is the discretionary spending. But it is supposed to adjust the 2/3 of government or 3/4 of government that's on autopilot. I am afraid that it's going to blow out our deficit and thereby blow out our debt over the next 10 years. I think the Republican plan to cut taxes without cutting spending is probably going to add another $30 trillion to our debt. In other words, we'll have $2 to $3.5 trillion deficits over the next 10 years. And what's going to happen, we won't have to wait 10 years to see the mal-effects of that. What we will see is that the people who buy our debt are going to say, you're not serious. And you're a risk, especially when they see us defaulting to countries like Russia, who have bought our debt. The next country we might default to is China, and the president would have some good excuse for doing that. But if we start not paying our debt to anybody, and we want to borrow more money, and by the way, these sovereign funds of foreign countries are buying less and less of it. It's more, I believe, institutional investors in the United States who are buying the debt. You're going to see the rates go up, and we could enter into this runaway condition where we just can't borrow enough money to service the debt. And if we're not the world's reserve currency, then we can't just inflate our money, dilute our money, and charge the rest of the world for, using inflation. It's going to be a bad situation. And so people are, I do have people telling me, they've got my personal cell phone number. They probably texted me during this show saying, support the president. We don't care. Whatever he wants. And I'm trying to tell them that the combination of things that Congress, which is the House and the Senate, are doing that look like it supports the president will cause the rational people in this equation, the people who are buying our debt, to take a second look and raise the price that we buy debt at. And it's not going to be good for this country. So that's my main objection to what's coming up in this reconciliation package, which covers the mandatory spending. And then the discretionary spending is going to be bad too. They're talking about going from like a $850 billion military budget to $1 trillion military budget. We're not at war.
Is that the reward for not passing an audit? What is the logic on this?
Who knows where all this money is going?
Yeah.
It's not going to pay the soldiers or give them better benefits. It's going to military contractors, and who knows where it's going. But we're not at war. We have more peace right now than we've ever had before. And I got to give President Trump credit. He hasn't started another war. The profligate spending in Ukraine, we can thank President Biden for that. And I have to thank President Trump personally on a phone call for not starting more wars. That was in his first presidency. So why do we need to spend more money on the military? We do not. We don't need to increase it by 10 or 15 or 20%. But that's just the contractors who are getting in there and getting more all the money they can get. And it's going to increase the price we pay for debt.
Yeah. So a political version of the argument you just made, because I still believe that good policy is good politics. And for America First and President Trump, with this midterm election looming and the economy struggling and inflation still nipping at our heels, you're drawing out a scenario where people are going to be hurting, and that means that the party out of power is going to get more power.
Mm-hmm.
Do they understand that?
I am very worried about the midterms. And like you said, it's because of the policy, not necessarily the politics. The politics is the lens that you pass the policy through and try to distort whatever's actually really happening into a political situation that you can win. But the policies we have right now, I met with people today in my office who are saying we're going to have to raise the price of our goods, automotive manufacturers, etc. I said, when is this going to happen? They're like, well, we'll wait until the next model year. These are automotive manufacturers, and then which is coming up pretty soon, to pass on these prices to the consumer, these costs that they have. I don't think the policy is necessarily the right policy. It's not what we voted for. We did not vote. So for instance, last week I told you I would have called it the nanny state week because we passed more regulations. And now with the tariffs, we're going to increase the price of things, but also we're increasing the uncertainty that businesses have to deal with. They don't know what the price of things is going to be, so they're going to charge you the higher price in case the tariffs are actually permanent and not temporary. I think we're not in good shape for the midterms.
So President Trump calls you tomorrow.
Which could happen. He has my number.
Which could happen.
We've talked.
And you've talked before.
Usually it's a good conversation.
Yeah. But if you have his ear and could lay out some key policy redirections over the next 3 to 6 months, and you just got a couple minutes of his attention, what are you going to tell him?
I would say give Bobby Kennedy as much power as you can. Like, just whatever he wants to do, make sure you support him because he's the best nominee you have. I would say quit trying to find me a primary opponent because I'm actually the original America First, Make America Healthy Again MAGA guy in Congress. I would say keep up the good work on not getting us into a war. Like, keep us out of wars.
Stop flirting with war in Iran.
Yeah. I would say whoever's in your cabinet who is trying to make America do whatever Israel wants, like, push them off to the side and tell them we got to make America great first. And then you'll be in good shape. If America's great, Israel will be in good shape. But we got to make America great. I would say make sure whatever you want to do, you lean on Mike Johnson and John Thune to make sure we consummate it in the House and the Senate. Mr. President, we don't have to get out of your way. We need to support what you're doing. So because everything you do by executive order is going to be undone in 3.5 years, actually maybe in 1.5 years if the Democrats take control of these two chambers. So tell Mike Johnson to quit fiddle farting around and do the real things, and tell these senators that you won the election, you have a mandate, and you're not going to play their game. They're going to play your game. You don't need them to just get out of your way and let you do executive orders. You need them to consummate what you're doing. Tell them that you understand that rescissions that which only require 51 votes in the Senate That's where your power is to get this stuff done. Make sure you get it done there or in the reconciliation bill, which only requires 51 votes in the Senate. Don't let these opportunities pass you up. And do it this year, because next year there's going to be zero interest from the senators and even Mike Johnson in helping these things. And also I would say, Elon Musk and DOGE found some really good stuff. To make that stick, it's got to be voted on in the House. Don't do continuing resolutions that are a cut, copy, paste of Biden's budget. Like, don't buy that crap when your advisors or the leaders in the House and the Senate come to you. Don't do a continuing resolution. Stand your ground and say, we want these changes. We want to cut USAID. We want to cut NPR. Because as much as people are whispering in your ear right now in your administration that you can do this all by executive order, the courts are tying you up, and the ultimate trump card is the power of the purse and make sure Congress consummates what you're trying to get done for America.
All right, we're going to clip that and send it to him on Truth Social.
All right, sounds good.
The call will happen immediately.
Yes.
Thank you, Congressman. That was an optimistic ending, I think.
I think so. I'm still hopeful, or I wouldn't be in Congress. I mean, the second I give up hope, I am leaving. I won't even finish my term. So I have hope. I have lots of hope. And there are other people, like Marjorie Taylor Greene this week, who said that bill to imprison Americans for 20 years and give them $1 million fine because they don't want to buy stuff from a certain country because they don't believe in what they're doing, that's a wrong bill. I mean, that gives me hope that there are other people who are saying those same things, and that we don't need more wars, and that we need to cut spending, and we don't need more regulations on what Americans can do.
I'm sold. I'm in. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Matt.
Be sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.